Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine to welcome back to our show Rick Anderson. He's a principal with Earnscliffe Strategy Group and long-term politico, very involved in Preston Manning's Reform Party, very involved in politics across Canada. You'll often see him on TV and hear his commentating. But most importantly, right now, he was in Glasgow for COP26, and he promised me that we would get an update on what happened, how were the parties, what was going on, was anything actually achieved, etc. Rick, welcome to our show. How are you?
Nice to see you, Brian. I'm fine, thank you, and hope you are as well.
Excellent. And Merry Christmas in advance, by the way, and Happy Holidays. So tell me, Glasgow, was it worth going?
Very much so for me. I enjoyed it immensely, met a lot of interesting people, learned a lot. And I'm very encouraged by what's going on in that space.
What do you think was accomplished?
Well, a number of things. I mean, first of all, as they say in the jargon of the environmental world, everybody upped their ambition, meaning that we increased our goals. Canada did likewise. Our goal for emission reduction for 2030 was 30% reduction, and now it's up to at least 40%. So, you know, that was basically done by most countries, or some version of that was done by most countries around the world. But we've seen a lot of target setting, and, you know, people are justified in, I think, being a little skeptical about whether or not these targets ever get met. What I found really more interesting was what I call, I think that whole area of, you know, environmental policy, which has now become intersected with economic policy. It's become less talk and more do, meaning the plans are becoming more serious, becoming more real. They're actually going into effect here in Canada. We've, you know, upped our carbon pricing from $30, $40 to what's going to be $170 a ton in 2030. You know, and around the world, there are variations on this. Different countries are choosing different methodologies, but I think it adds up to something much more tangible and much more real than it has been in the past.
We chatted very briefly about the Prime Minister's speech, and you said it was a pretty impactful one. Tell me about that.
Well, you know, one of the things that people who do public speaking know is that oftentimes shorter is better. And the format at COP is that the various leaders, I think almost 200 leaders spoke during the Leaders' Days. They were limited to 5 minutes each. And
I can't imagine all those leaders speaking for only 5 minutes.
That's true, but it's actually much more impactful. You know, you hear President Biden and President Macron and Prime Minister Johnson, Boris Johnson, and so on, and our own Prime Minister Trudeau get up and in 5 minutes say what they want to say to the world about this. And it, you know, just the shortness of it, the focus of it is quite impactful. But the Prime Minister also has a better story to tell than Canada's had because of what I was mentioning earlier, where we've actually got a more robust climate plan, the one that was announced by then Environment Minister Wilkinson a year ago. We're making significant progress on phasing out coal across the country, which is you know, Ontario's already done that. The rest of the country is catching up to Ontario in that area. It's the biggest thing Canada's done yet in emission reduction. So he's got a story to tell, but he also bracketed it by beginning and ending by talking about Lytton, BC, you know, a town not far from me here near Whistler, BC, the one that had the tragedy during the heat dome in the summer of bursting into flames and basically disappearing in a couple of hours to a wildfire.
And he was effectively blaming it on climate change. Is that justifiable, do you think?
No, I think people are generally careful to attribute specific events to that. You know, the temperature there was 44 degrees. We've never had a place hit 44 degrees in Canada in history that we know of. I mean, who knows what was going on 50 million years ago? But you know, and now just more recently, the last few weeks, we've had these incredible floods, and not just floods, but you know, torrential floods coming down the mountain crevices and wiping out concrete four-lane highway concrete bridges and railway bridges in half a dozen different places in BC. I mean, this stuff hasn't been happening. And I think as part of a larger trend, we are seeing the kind of extreme weather that people have been forecasting. But I mean, storms, I mean, forest fires can also start with lightning strikes and tossed cigarettes. We know that. And I don't think I want to blame everything on climate change. But certainly there's a pattern here. I mean, we just saw those awful tornadoes in Kentucky this week. It's one thing after another, it seems to be. And, these are actually different events. We've had tornadoes before and floods before and wildfires before, but not quite like these.
We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson, principal of Earnscliffe Strategy Group, about COP26 and what was accomplished and what the experience was like. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Rick. And I'm going to ask him what actually happens. We've heard there's tens of thousands of people. There's great events. There's several zones. I want to hear a little bit from someone who was actually there. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Rick Anderson, who is a principal with Earnscliffe Strategy Group. He was an attendee at COP26 in Glasgow, I guess last month, and has come back to talk about it. Rick, you and I have been to lots of conferences and conventions, but this one sounds like it was pretty unique. I understand there were tens of thousands of delegates. There were different zones that different people were allowed to go to. Just give us a roadmap. Just give us a sort of a 36,000 feet overview of the 2 weeks and what was happening and what you got to do.
Well, like you say, we've been to dozens of political conventions, and big ones of those are typically 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, maybe. This was 39,000 people. Delegates.
39,000 people.
30,000 people, and all on one topic, or really, I guess, maybe on a dozen different dimensions of what is one topic. I mean, talking about the economics of it, talking about the technologies of it, and so on, the public policy side. So there's a lot of subcategories to that conversation, but it's really basically everybody's there for one particular reason, which is not the case with your standard political convention. So it was like your political convention meets the Super Bowl.
Political convention meets the Super Bowl. That's great.
Yeah. And it had all the razzmatazz that goes with that. I mean, the media, I don't know how many media were accredited to it, but the media room was massive. I wandered in and out of it a couple of times, and there's probably a couple of thousand people in there. Camera setups from all around the world, people talking in all kinds of different languages. The security, of course, was extraordinary. You had almost 200 leaders from almost every country in the world there. So guess what that means for security. Anyway, it all went off without a hitch in the middle of a pandemic. We all had to get tested. We tested ourselves every single day in our hotel rooms before we went over to the site. You had to do that before you went there with those self tests, which I thought worked out pretty well. I mean, it's a convention, so people were in pretty close quarters for 2 weeks. I know some people who ended up with COVID out of it, and some of them have been in the news, but there was no massive outbreak or anything like that, which itself is a miracle.
Tell us about these different zones. What were they all about?
Well, like I said, some of them are sort of topical. Some of them are, who you are. So there's a bunch of pavilions that are displays, exhibits that are like a trade show. And one area is it's kind of the countries that have exhibits about themselves and about their own commitment to climate change. And to fighting climate change. And other places, it's companies and technologies showcasing their wares, nuclear power, hydrogen, and so on, carbon capture, better agriculture. Sorry, somebody wants to talk to me here. There's countries telling their stories, technologies telling their stories, companies telling their stories, environmental groups telling their stories, all in these displays all over the place. And then there's 3 or 4 big plenary rooms, they call them. There's not just one massive plenary room, because you couldn't put 40,000 people in a room unless it really was the Super Bowl. So there's big plenary rooms where there's a few thousand people, and lots of other rooms with spillover, screens and all that stuff that we're used to. But then there's all kinds of side panel discussions. You just wander into a room and you'll find people talking about fusion or all kinds of technologies that are people are working on, have been sometimes for decades. and it's really quite interesting. You just sit yourself down and listen to whatever conversation's going on about something, and you randomly bump into stuff. I was in the room when the head of the IEA, International Energy Agency, announced on the Thursday of the first Thursday of the conference, about halfway through it, that the pledges that had been made so far in that conference were enough to bring us down below the world forecast, temperature increase forecast, below 2 degrees, which is a big threshold that a lot of people talk about and has been eluding us up until then. And he just got up and he was bubbling with enthusiasm about announcing this. And some poor person at the back of that room, again, another big room with 1,000 people in it or something, collapsed and had to be taken away by medics. I never even heard what happened to him. I don't know, it's like being in a big city for 2 weeks where you hear things are going on, but you never actually bump into them. And in the middle of all that, there are negotiations going on amongst the governments about various issues that are arisen or to-dos that are on their list, like the definitions of, how do you count forestry offsets and so on, the technique of doing things like that so that they're verifiable, auditable, and tradable between countries. And one of the themes of this COP was the investment community was there, institutional investors, financial institutions, in large numbers, a couple hundred of them that represent something like, I can't remember now, $75 trillion worth of assets being managed. And they've announced that they're aligning their portfolios and encouraging the companies they invest in to align their activities with the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. So, of course, what they also want is quantifiable measures of progress, not just feel-good promises and statements and glossy reports saying how good we are and so on. They need, if they're going to invest in these technologies and invest in emission reduction, they want to see actual results because they're investing funds on behalf of their beneficiaries, their pension beneficiaries or their shareholders or whoever they are.
I heard some criticism from some activists that it was almost taken over by either these financial institutions, the capital providers, and or the companies that were there, that they felt there were a lot less activists and a lot more corporate interests represented. What do you think?
Well, I think they're right about what you just said at the end there. The institutional investment community is not there to do feel-good things. It's there to do things that are beneficial investments. I think that brings, and of course, the best way to do that is, doing well by doing good, as people say. So if you can invest in things that benefit other people or benefit the planet at large, and it's profitable, fantastic. But they're not there to lose their pension beneficiaries, your money or my money or your listeners' money. They're there to invest in things that are going to produce a return for them. And I think that brings a different kind of discipline to this process. That they're, like I said earlier, they're actually looking for tangible results, measurable results, things you can, technologies that actually do what they say they're going to do, which is to reduce emissions on a cost-effective basis, and therefore get purchased by more people around the world, whether they're cars or trucks or building, energy efficient furnaces or agricultural techniques and so on. Those big institutional investors are now investing in that kind of thing, which is another proof point that it's getting more real, in my view. It loses a bit of its idealistic quality. That's what I think the environmental groups you're referring to are concerned about. But there's significant money, significant money coming to the table, and by people who are looking for actual tangible results out of it. So I think that brings, first of all, more resources, which are badly needed, into this, but also the discipline of financial reporting.
Can we feel confident that these commitments are going to be met when it appears that people have made lots of commitments in the past and none of them have been met, it would appear?
Well, I don't think we should take that for granted. But I do think that there's a different feel to what's going on. First of all, I think the concern is more widely shared now than it has been over the years. Public opinion is now like in 75, 80% levels of support for significant efforts to reduce emissions. We've got industry very engaged. They understand that public policy is pushing them in significant ways to do this. So they're shopping for technologies that will actually help them achieve that and to do so cost effectively. You got the investment community, as I was mentioning. So I do think that we've now got a lot more momentum and a lot more tangible activity going on. I mean, you can look around. 10 years ago, it was somewhat daunting if you were, say, an energy company or petrochemical company or a transportation company to say, well, you've got to reduce your emissions. Well, how am I supposed to do that? But now they've got answers. And in most cases, depending on the sector you're in, they've got 2 or 3 different answers. They can electrify with clean electricity, so replace the use of natural gas or oil in cars and buildings. With electricity, and because we're doing such a fabulous job in Canada of cleaning up our electricity grid, we are the 6th biggest. Canada is the 6th biggest producer of electricity in the world, and of those 6 big electricity producers, our grid is the cleanest, meaning the lowest in carbon emissions. That's something Canadians never hear, but it's true. Our electricity grid is the 6th in the world. You can look it up. And 6th largest in the world, and it's 82% emissions free. And none of the 5 who are larger than us have got a cleaner grid than that. So there are small countries that have got 100% renewable electricity grids, but nobody making electricity on the scale that Canada does is as clean as Canada is. So electrification is a path for a lot of companies. Or buildings, or governments, or hospitals who are trying to reduce emissions, or universities or schools. Hydrogen is looking like it will be. Carbon capture, energy conservation, natural offsets, planting trees, which are carbon, which absorb carbon. There's all kinds of things now going on that are answers to the question: how am I supposed to meet these requirements? And that's another change.
I understand that there's quite a large trade show of people showcasing those different technologies. Were there ones that you saw that were kind of intriguing to you?
Well, I was struck. I'm quite familiar with some of them. I mean, I'm quite involved with that. In fact, I was there representing the Hydrogen Association of Canada. So there was a fair lot of hydrogen, which can be used to make electricity, can be used to heat your house, can be used to power a truck or a train or a car. So there's a lot of versatility to hydrogen, and clean hydrogen. Green hydrogen has no emissions other than a few drops of water. It's a game-changing technology. That's my little advertisement for hydrogen. The nuclear industry was there, which I've also done work with. I'm familiar with that. There's a lot of momentum around that now. There's probably more nuclear construction going on in the world than ever before. Of course, China, one of the countries people love to kick around in the climate policy area. China's building more clean nuclear reactors than anybody in the world right now. In fact, they've got as many nuclear reactors under construction in China as in the rest of the world combined. China is also leading the world in building solar installations and manufacturing solar panels. China's leading the world in wind turbine, rolling out wind turbines. They're leading the world in hydroelectricity. They're still burning too much coal, but they did come to the table and say that they're going to phase that out, but not as quickly as the West wants. And if you look at how much clean energy China is also simultaneously investing in, one of these days we're going to wake up, probably in 10 or 15 years from now, and China will be able to replace the brag I made about Canada and say they've got the cleanest and biggest grid in the world.
Well, it's interesting because you commented about how we've got such a clean grid. And I heard the statistic, I'm not sure it's completely true, but the statistic I heard was that Ontario as a jurisdiction has done more to reduce emissions than any other jurisdiction, state, province like that anywhere in the world over the course of the last several decades. But it's primarily because, number one, we phased out of coal, and number two, we replaced it with nuclear. And so therefore it really was a commitment to nuclear that and getting out of coal that made that massive change. And so the question you got to ask is, are you comfortable with nuclear, Rick?
I am, for sure. I mean, I'm sitting here in BC where there's no nuclear power. You're in Ontario. where I've lived a lot of my life, and the nuclear power is the most important power supply in Ontario. Nuclear power and hydroelectricity have been the backbone of Ontario energy economy, for 100 years. The nuclear part of that is extending its life, with refurbishments of the big nuclear plants in Ontario. When these are finished, those plants will be into the 60th year of their lives. Who knew when they were built that they would produce clean power so reliably, so efficiently for 60 years? Anyway, yes, I do think nuclear power is part of the equation here, but I don't think it's the only part, and it's probably not even the largest part of it. It's just, electricity has two kinds. It has many more kinds than that, but two basic types: base load, the stuff that you could flip a switch and you have some, basically open a dam and produce a hydropower, start up a nuclear reactor or crank it up another level, and you control the volume of power that's being produced. The other kinds of power, like wind and solar, are called intermittent supply. They're fantastic when you've got them, when the wind's blowing, when the sun's shining, and they're really part of the mix here. We didn't just replace coal in Ontario with nuclear. We also replaced it with a lot of wind and solar, as everybody in Ontario knows. But so it's the combination of these things working together that helps us have that humongous clean electricity grid. But backstopping it are baseload power, and there used to be four kinds of that: hydro and nuclear, which have no carbon emissions, no greenhouse gas, and natural gas and coal, which do have greenhouse gas emissions. Well, like you said, Ontario, I don't know about the world, Brian. I don't know that that's not true with regards to the world, but I do know that in North America, Ontario's transition from coal electricity is the most important thing that anybody has done yet to fight to lower emissions. And Ontarians are justifiably proud of that, should be justifiably proud of it if they knew that it even happened. All we do is fight about electricity and never really stand back and pay attention to how much of it we've got, and how reliable it is, and how clean it's become over the years. It took 14 years of hard work by multiple governments to see that through, see that elimination of coal through in Ontario. And now it's spreading right across the country. People in the rest of Canada are following the example of Ontario.
We're chatting with Rick Anderson about COP26 and climate change and the impact on the environment. I'm going to take a break for some messages and come back more. And I'm going to ask Rick what the implications are for Canada and Canadian industry and Canadian employment. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio while we're on Saga 960. It's an honor of mine to be chatting tonight with Rick Anderson. He's a principal with Cliff Strategy Group, and he has recently come back from Glasgow, Scotland, where he was there representing Canada at COP26, I guess representing the hydrogen industry, you said, at COP26, which is the 30, did you say 60,000 people or 36,000 people?
39,000 people.
39,000 people that were there from around the world talking about climate change and how we could reduce it. Rick, some people are worried that everything that climate change and carbon taxes and regulatory requirements and anti-pollution, et cetera, are going to do for the oil industry in Alberta. And I wonder what you think the future of Fort McMurray and Edmonton and Calgary and the oil industry in Alberta is, given everything that happened at COP26.
Well, what a great question. So I'm an optimist. I also have a lot of faith in human being, human innovation, and human responsibility, and I have a lot of faith in technology. So I think that what we're going to see in Canada, we export three kinds of energy in Canada right now. There's two more coming on stream. The three kinds of energy we export, which are our biggest area of exports, about 30% of Canada's exports are in the form of energy: natural gas and electricity. We export almost all of that to the United States because the nature of these things is they ship best by either pipelines or wires, which are a physical grid and work a lot better in a contiguous space like North America. So we export a lot of energy. So we've got a lot at stake in the energy transition, which is caused by the global effort to reduce emissions. So those sectors, all three of them, oil, natural gas, and electricity, need to respond. They are responding, and we're talking about the electricity. And I believe that the oil and gas sectors are also doing the same thing. I mean, on the gas side, one of the most dangerous greenhouse gases is methane. And we're making great strides there now on trapping what's called fugitive methane. It's very difficult to capture methane. It's a small molecule, so it's, every time you have pipes connecting to each other under pressure, things can their way out. And methane is a very small molecule, so it's harder to contain, but it does a lot more damage in the upper atmosphere than most of the other greenhouse gases that we're dealing with. So natural gas has got their challenges, and so does oil. Fort McMurray, as you were mentioning, the oil sands. You don't have to take my word for it. The 6 biggest oil sands companies in Canada, CNRL, Canadian Natural Resources Limited, Suncor, Canada, those are one company now, Imperial Oil, ConocoPhillips, Meg Energy, and Cenovus. They produce 95% of the oil in the oil sands in Canada, which is the biggest part of our energy production in the whole country. And those 6 companies have banded together and formed something called the Oil Sands Pathways to Net 2050 Alliance. And they've gotten together, they've endorsed the goal of net zero emissions by 2050, collaborating on public policy and economics and technologies that will help make that happen. So you should get one of them on the show to talk about that. Well, I stand there and look at them and say, this is very brave what they're committing themselves to. And it's very important, as you say, to the Canadian economy, because it's such a large part of our exports. So I think that, all of the sectors have got a role to play in here. Energy is the biggest emitter of all, but second, right behind energy is transportation, and that's something that you and I and all the listeners here can influence by just switching to cleaner vehicles, even if it's just switching to more fuel efficient vehicles without old gasoline and diesel. But we're getting into, of course, electric vehicles. We're getting into hydrogen vehicles, no emission hydrogen vehicles, getting into hybrids and so on. So there's a lot of things that people can do. But the oil and gas sector is, at the front of the line of people who need to respond. And I think basically, I think most of the people in that sector know that if they can't respond, they're going to end up like coal, going basically, we'll end up phasing out that sector, or at least for energy production. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think they're going to innovate. They've got carbon capture they can do. They can use electrification to reduce the amount of natural gas that oil companies burn to produce oil. They use a lot of energy, create energy. They can do that more cleanly. There's a lot they can do, and they know that, and they're getting serious about doing it.
I had a transportation expert on my show. You'll, I think, find this interesting. He said the most important thing that any of us can do as individuals to influence climate change is to buy an electric vehicle. He said that so much comes from transportation, and we lower our costs dramatically if we go to electric. And what that's going to do is create huge amount of demand, such that all these oil and gas companies and car companies are going to see the demand and are therefore going to have to adjust more quickly than they otherwise would have. He said the one negative is that gas taxes are going to go down dramatically, and there's going to be no money left for transit. But he said individually, the most important thing we can do is buy electrical cars.
Well, he's right. Or use transit, or use transit. But yeah, that's right. We have the technology now. Our household, we've got an electric vehicle and a hybrid. We got the hybrid because we had range anxiety when we bought the electric vehicle 3 years ago. Well, we've never encountered a reason to be anxious about the range of our electric vehicle. It's first of all, instead of rushing home to charge it up every night, which is kind of what you think about it before you have an electric vehicle, we charge it up a couple of times a week. That's all it takes, a couple of hours. So most people don't drive long distances, but if you do, you need to make sure you get a car with the kind of range that can support that. And if you drive really super long distances, you probably want to wait for the technology to keep evolving. It's doubling. Cars are doubling, and the electric vehicles are doubling in their range every 2 or 3 years now. That's in the technology world, which is what I used to do before I decided that I was really wanting to focus on energy, 20 years ago. In the digital world, there's a thing called Moore's Law, which talks about computing capacity doubling every 3 years or whatever it is. I can't remember what the law is. But the same thing's happening with electric vehicles. Same thing's happening with a lot of the energy technologies. Same thing happens with a lot of different technologies. Battery storage is going to be a big part of the story. The idea here, Elon Musk isn't just a genius about electric vehicles and space exploration or space technology. He's got this concept that we'll all have kind of imagine an LED screen hanging on, it's not a screen, it's a battery, but it looks like an LED screen hanging on the wall of your garage, and it's a big battery. And so all night long, this battery would suck power out of the grid when there's too much power being produced. And governments, utilities sometimes have to offload it at a loss because demand is so much weaker at night, so much later at night. Well, instead of wasting that power or selling it for 2 cents a kilowatt hour, let's charge up those batteries in people's homes, individual homes, and then live off those batteries the next day instead of sucking live power out of the wind, out of the grid at the time when demand is much higher because all industrial activity is underway and lights are on and heating and all that kind of stuff is going on. And so that there's kind of this constant cycle of, taking power out of the grid and putting it back in. We can make our grids much more efficient. In other words, go twice as far with the same amount of generating capacity as we do now, because we would be using storage in an intelligent way to time shift the gathering and distribution of electricity. There's all kinds of things like that going on. But electric vehicles, absolutely, Brian, they're fantastic. Zero emission vehicles. I mean, they have the same emissions associated with the construction, the manufacture of the vehicles as any other kind of car, but for the energy consumption while they're operating, if your grid is clean, then so is that energy source. And they're also, like you mentioned, much cheaper to operate. Less than half the cost of energy. Electricity is that much cheaper than gasoline, and also maintenance. I mean, when you take the muffler system out of a car, the exhaust system out of a car, the water cooling system out of the car. When you take out all the pumps for oil and water and gas, the electronic timing systems, fuel ignition systems. Take all of that out of a car. You're left with an electric motor and a battery and a transmission. That's an electric vehicle. And those things don't need anything like the kind of maintenance that internal combustion engines need. So you save a fortune in maintenance as well as in fuel costs.
I was in Alberta 2 weeks ago, and everywhere I went, I heard hydrogen, 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 as if that's the salvation. Tell me about the impact of hydrogen on Fort McMurray in Alberta.
So hydrogen, a lot of people do think, and I've mentioned, I do some work with the Hydrogen Association. I've represented them at COP. But the hydrogen is something that it's not a new idea. It's been around. Companies like Ballard here in Canada were pioneers in the hydrogen sector 30 years ago. And if at COP, you could see buses and ambulances and so on being displayed that when you look under the hood, there's a Ballard fuel cell in there. So what's hydrogen? It's the most common element in the world, as everybody in high school learns. It's a combination of water and oxygen. And when you separate those two things, you get H2 and O. And the and you can use it. You can use it to create heat, to warm your house. You can use it as a fuel source in your vehicles, and every kind of vehicle, ships. The Canadian Pacific has got the first demonstration hydrogen locomotive on the rails this week in Canada. There's a train in Scotland, a Hydrail train in Scotland, another one in Germany. I mean, not a train, a set of train sets, a route that's a pilot project for hydrogen rail. No overhead wires, no diesel being burned, just clean hydrogen, no emissions.
So tell me logistically what happens in Fort McMurray. They take the bitumen out of the oil sands, and right then there they convert it into hydrogen.
Well, no, you don't typically turn oil into hydrogen. The opportunity with hydrogen is natural gas. The methane in natural gas can be turned into hydrogen quite easily. That's not green hydrogen, it's called blue hydrogen. Never mind the colors, it's just too confusing. But there's still some emissions left with that, but 60% less than there would be with regular natural gas. So you can make hydrogen from natural gas. So it's a big opportunity for the oil patch in Alberta. And when you do that, that can be used. That hydrogen can be used as an input to petrochemical plants, and it can be used in cement plants and so on. Cement plants are one of the most emissions intense pieces of Canadian industry, and that's a very energy intense process, making cement. And so it's also quite emissions. There's a lot of emissions associated with it, and it's not easy to find substitutes for that process. But hydrogen can be used in petrochemical plants and steel refineries and cement plants to dramatically reduce their emissions. It's plentiful, like I said, and it's one of the things that people are looking at in Alberta as one of the transition strategies for the oil and gas industry.
And then how do you ship it?
You can ship it by pipe in either liquid form or under pressure as a gas. That depends on temperature. Again, your high school chemistry. I'm sure if I tested you on this, you would know the point at which hydrogen becomes a gas versus a liquid. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I'm not. I'd be just making it up. But you can store it as a gas or as a liquid. You can ship it in a pipeline as a gas or a liquid, or you can put it in containers. You can like propane tankers, propane canisters. You can put it in ships. So it's easier to ship than other forms of energy. And easier. One of the things you can do with hydrogen is readily convert it into electricity. One of the ways it was talking about making it from natural gas. The other way to make hydrogen is from water, just simply water, and you use electrolysis to do that. And so you use electricity, to separate the hydrogen molecule from the oxygen molecule. Water is H2O, that has no emission. It's more expensive to do it that way, which is why we tend to do in Canada, and for the next few years, the next couple of decades probably, we'll be making more hydrogen from natural gas than from water. But both are going to be growing because they're so versatile and they store quite easily. One of the problems with electricity, we were talking about batteries a few minutes ago. One of the problems with electricity is storing it is not easy. You can't store it indefinitely, and it takes quite a lot of space to store it in batteries. But hydrogen you can store more simply, and you can convert it readily back into electricity when you need it. That's a big advantage for hydrogen.
We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson of Earnscliffe Strategy Group about COP26, about climate change, about the oil and gas industry in Alberta, and about hydrogen. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Rick Anderson, principal of Earnscliffe, long-term political activist, political person. I think that you were, what was it, chief of staff to Preston Manning, one of the big organizers of the reform movement?
I was his campaign director.
You were obviously very involved in right wing. I won't say conservative politics, but right wing politics and reform, and Alberta at the time. You were, as you mentioned, very involved, and you and I ran across each other when you were very involved in high tech technology. What attracted you to be so interested in climate change and environmental issues?
Well, I've got a portfolio of things that I follow fairly closely, different areas of public policy. I mean, we could have a long conversation about foreign policy or trade policy. I'd be equally interested in those.
Let's schedule the interview.
Okay. I think that a healthy economy is the underpinning of so many of the things that Canadians like about this country, whether that's a good public education system or a good public healthcare system, or the fantastic infrastructure we've got in this country, and fantastic universities and hospitals and so on. The more healthy our economy is, the more able we are to provide those things for ourselves. So, I mean, I think there are not very many areas of public policy I'm not interested in, but over the years, and partly because of what seems to be the growing threat of climate change, I've become, like everybody else, or like many other people, pretty preoccupied with that. And for a while, it seemed like there wasn't much progress. And governments were stubborn, politics were unstable, a lot of bad information, ill information, misinformation, disinformation going around, and so on. And so I decided that, this is important. It's important to our future. It's important to our well-being. You and I are probably not going to be around to see the positive or negative results of getting this right or wrong, but our kids are. And, before I was a conservative, I was a liberal, Brian. We also crossed paths there. I was part of the Stuart Smith Liberal Party in Ontario, and the David Peterson worked on both their leadership campaigns back then, and also worked on Don Johnson's leadership campaign for the Federal Liberal Party. And my first campaign was with Pierre Trudeau. Anyway, that's ancient history, really ancient history. Conservatives don't like me to tell those stories, so that's why I tell them all the time anyway. But I think the environment, back there in the 60s and 70s, when I was first getting involved in politics, people used to talk about leaving the world a better place than you found it. And if you looked around in the 60s and 70s, places like Love Canal and the level of pollution in the Great Lakes, it was just astonishing how careless people were. And we got serious about that in our societies and our communities and our politics and so on, and in our industry. We cleaned up a lot of things. And there's now salmon back in Lake Ontario, right? I didn't even know there were salmon in Lake Ontario ever. Now I hear they're back in Lake Ontario. And that's how fast the nature can take care of itself if we give it half a chance. And I think we need to start doing that. We need to start doing that about the climate change.
Well, and we used to have, numerous smog days in Toronto. And smog days are almost a thing of the past because of the closing of all the coal plants. And that's something that people don't notice until you point it out. But then they go, you're right. The air is cleaner. There's just no question about it.
Yeah. We started closing those coal plants because of what you're talking about. The air was brown. You could be sitting in downtown Toronto in one of those buildings and look out at the lake and it would be brown. I mean, the air would be brown. And Mike Harris and the Harris government were the ones in power at the time when, that summer of 2001, where air quality warnings were the norm in Toronto. And the public pressure was rising and rising and rising to do something about it. So the Harris government were the first ones to close one of those coal plants in Ontario. And within a year, which is an astonishingly short period of time in politics, within a year, all three Ontario parties in the legislature had produced an all-party agreement report on the need to close the rest of the coal plants that made up the Ontario coal electricity fleet. That happened within 18 months. And it happened not because of, we were already talking about climate change in those days, but that's not what drove this decision. It was the air pollution that everybody was breathing and could see discoloring their houses and their cars and their grass and everything else. And we were all breathing it, people who were in Toronto or people who were near any of those plants. So and I remember thinking in the early days of the pandemic here in Vancouver, which has right by the ocean pretty clear air all the time. But when the first lockdown occurred in the spring of 2000, I remember walking out here with my wife and noticing how clean the air was because nothing was going on. Now, that's not exactly how we're going to clean up our environment, have nothing going on, nobody driving or anything like that. But it was quiet. There was no cars on the highway around here, around where we are. And the air was stunningly differently clear. And you could feel, taste it. Even here by the sea where it's really usually pretty clear. So another reminder that we just got to be more careful about this environment. If we about the natural environment we depend on so much and we enjoy so much.
Last question, Rick. What could go wrong? What are you worried about?
Well, there's all the big things that could go wrong in the world, geopolitics. So we could end up with conflict. There are pressures around the world are worrying. And if one of those turns into, some kind of armed conflict, God forbid, it'll distract us and we'll do what's necessary to defend, anyway, I don't want to, humans could go wrong is the short answer. The more likely scenario is bad politics. Politics can derail this things. Energy infrastructure, which is the core of what needs to be fixed to reduce emissions. Most of those emissions, one sort or another, start with some form of energy. The politics around the energy sector, the politics around emissions and so on are quite intense. And people take some pretty stubborn positions. But one of the things we need to understand, and why the whole discussion has moved towards a 2050 timeframe, is because energy infrastructure requires long-term thinking, it requires long-term decision making. You can't just half build a gas plant and then throw away $1 billion and abandon it, or start building a wind farm and abandon it uncompleted, or start, go through a process of approving a pipeline and then cancel it. We've got to be more disciplined about what we're doing here. We've got to stick with the decisions we make. We've got to see them through. And I worry about politics unsettling these things. I worry less about it than I did 5 years ago, because I think that there's more of a public consensus. And at the end of the day, voters drive political parties. So hopefully we'll see less of that kind of inconsistency of policy, less backing and forthing and, doing and undoing things. We've got a program now that's, I think, basically working. It can be improved. It can go faster. It can go higher. And I hope that we start putting our attention to how to make things work better rather than undoing things that are already going in the right direction.
Rick Anderson, principal of Earnscliffe Strategy Group, thank you so much for updating us on COP26 and giving us a sense of what happened there, what your optimism is and what your concerns are. And I enjoyed your conversation about Alberta and hydrogen as well. Thanks so much. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Brian.